Guys, thank you very much for coming. It's a hot topic, to be frank with you, and it's changing very fast. So let me introduce the panel before we start off. This lady here with the red hair, Fenella Barber, is the founder of Bao Advisory, former advisor to China-Britain Business Council. Fenella Barber has lived and worked in Hangzhou, Hong Kong, Beijing, and was key organizer of China Now, one of the first business-backed festivals between China and the UK, and has a wealth of experience. At the far end, we have Professor Bill Derodi, Chair of Risk and Security and International Relations at the University of Bath. He previously held posts in British Columbia and in Singapore, and has been an Associate Fellow of the International Security Program at Chatham House for over a decade. And in 2014, he became a visiting professor of the China Executive Leadership Academy of Shanghai, one of China's top-level party schools. Not school parties, party school. Down in the middle, between the two of them there, we have Cindy Yu, who read PPE at Oxford University, specializing in Chinese political propaganda and modern youth opinion. And she's written extensively and appeared on the media extensively about Chinese society, a much sought-after expert on Chinese issues. She's a social science graduate who became a store manager. This is the background story that we all love. Store manager at Lidl. See, even you two could be up here. At Lidl, and then took up an internship at The Spectator, and the rest is history. She's now the broadcast editor for The Spectator magazine and a regular media commentator. And then finally, last but not least, we have Lijia Zhang, who is a former factory worker who's become a writer, social commentator, writing in English for international publications. She's the author of the memoir Socialism in Great. I have it in my bag. It's a great read, described by somebody as the David Copperfield of China. It's a fantastic read. Socialism Great, about her decade-long experience working at a rocket factory in Nanjing. So that's a wide-ranging panel, great list of experience. For my humble background, I'm Austin Williams. I chair the Future Cities Project. I lived and worked in China for 7 years, so I've got a little bit of background in this, and I'm fascinated by what's going on. As Hong Kong has flared up over the last 6 months or so, Hong Kong has just officially been announced just this week to be in a recession, an economic recession. And last week, the US questioned the treaty arrangements between Hong Kong, and the protests are now in their 20th week, and people are still protesting. Joshua Wong, who's one of the leaders of the pro-democracy movement, has said that, quote, "There is no end game. That's the infinity war that Hong Kong people are willing to engage in." Which is a kind of a reference to a Marvel comic superhero movie, Infinity War, but he's making a point that there's no real, doesn't seem to be, many kind of endpoint demands or goals that seem to be implementable. This is a very free-flowing, free-form protest. Protesters, in some respects, have called in the old colonial powers to help out, and then Carrie Lam has invoked colonial-era emergency powers to ban face masks in the last fortnight, and protesters have been described by rioters in China and pro-democracy movements in the West. So again, we're happy to kind of take all shades of opinion here. Yes? You can say what you wish. What we're trying to do, effectively, I wanted the title of the session to be called Hong Kong, What the Hell is Going On? Yes? So that's it. So what I want to do is, instead of having individual speeches, if I can just tease out some of these general topics and themes of what's been going on in a kind of a more structured way, and you can intervene if you wish. Is it possible any of you on the panel here might want to be able to give us at least some background of Hong Kong, the history of Hong Kong, China, Hong Kong, UK, the structure of the LegCo government?
It was 1997, the handover, as many people know. Basic law went in, and it's there till 2047, and we will discuss all of the implications from that. The background before that was it was a colony of the UK for a very long time. Interestingly, I was at the China-Britain Business Council, where during this period, Hong Kong was always treated separately. So we've always had a split, I think, within the Foreign Office, and there was always mainland China and other. So we were both very strong as a country on what was happening in Hong Kong, but actually in some of the outputs it was quite separate, which was confusing a little bit later for some people. The history before that, and it is very relevant, and Austin slightly in advance has said we could cover the history quite quickly, but there's a period of national humiliation, or whatever the phrase is, that is incredibly important to China. It's taught in Chinese schools, and it's something that we shouldn't gloss over that quickly because it's to do with the Opium Wars. It's to do with a point of history of which we're not that familiar over here in the West, but in which Chinese students learn about at school. So that actually might even be worth having a quick cover on. And that's some of the key background to some of the aspects of what's going on today.
Okay.
I'm not so up on the structure of the Hong Kong government per se, but maybe both.
For anybody who's interested, I think the articles that matter are probably 25, 26 and 27, which are all the ones about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, protection from torture. And then Article 45, which expresses an aspiration towards moving to democratic decision-making. That's kind of the meat of where much of the debate is at the moment. I find myself very conflicted, constantly flitting between different positions in relation to what's going on there, because I think superficially we see the aspiration of not inconsequential layer of society for that declaration that they would move towards open and free elections, which is kind of expressed in Article 45. The problem, of course, right at the beginning of the Basic Law is that it says very clearly that Beijing will interpret everything to do with the Basic Law. We should never forget that. But you know, if you look at the track record of the protesters post the British leaving, it hasn't been glorious. You know, a lot of the early protests in Hong Kong were very petty, parochial protests about smelly Chinese mainlanders coming over to steal their powdered milk in the aftermath of the melamine tainted milk poisoning scandal. Again, too many Chinese coming over to abuse the potential of giving birth in Hong Kong and obtaining rights, you know, and it was very exclusivist in its early inception. Many protests in those days, you know, showing the old British Hong Kong flag. Then, of course, you have the umbrella protest that maybe quite a few of people in the audience will be familiar with from, you know, about 5 years ago, which did bring Hong Kong to a standstill, but Beijing played a very clever game, which was to, you know, you just wait, you sit and wait. And I think that the important lesson there was that the protesters didn't do much else other than sit and occupy the city centre. And if you are going to be successful in almost any political project, you are going to have to engage a wider community than just yourselves, and you are going to have to go out and win the argument with that community. And you know, on this occasion, they appear to have learnt some of those lessons. They're clearly mobilising significantly greater numbers. It's the 22nd weekend now, Austin, and just a few hours ago they were being, you know, shot down with tear gas yet again, and they smashed the offices of Xinhua, the Chinese national news agency. And you know, I don't know. You kind of feel conflicted in as much as you recognise an aspiration to freedom, but you kind of. My concerns would be, how are they going to achieve that? Have they truly learnt the lesson? There's been this, and I'll just finish on this point. One of the big demands today was about getting international recognition. Some of you may know that only a week ago, the US Senate passed a bill, the Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act, which actually talks much more about trading relations with Hong Kong than protecting people in Hong Kong, as it happens. And I fear they're making a mistake by putting a lot of effort into getting supposed international solidarity, rather than doing that hard graft of winning the argument with the people on your doorstep. At the end of the day, if you want change, it's the people who are going to have to live with it that you have to win over.
Okay, look, that was a kind of a good summation of the entire debate, and we could now all go.
Okay.
Because what I was trying to do is just the background, as far as I'm concerned, and Fenella kind of pointed at it, that whole kind of 19th century opium wars, 1840s, where the territories were ceded, yes, to the British state, done through the East India Company. So the British colonialists taking tea from India, going to China, or taking opium, and then making sure that they could get all those wonderful kind of ceramics and silks from China by paying for it in opium. or at least kind of using opium to kind of degrade the market demand. So that then transforming China and the southern provinces of China into this kind of opium doped up world, such a disgraceful kind of historical reality. It's kind of worth realizing, and that's part of that kind of 100 years of humiliation. Starting off, the point being is that in the 1880s, 1890s, when the new territories were ceded to the British, that was done on just a very simple kind of back of a fag packet deal, and that was the 100-year history, 100-year lease that ran out in 1997. Yeah, so that's when all things that I'm sure we become to recognize 1997 as a key point where Britain handed back to China this territory which it had seized in all kinds of chicanery and terrible ways 100 years earlier. So there were protests earlier on in the 60s, protesting about the Cultural Revolution and all that. But I think understanding that is a useful point. The second thing I just wanted to kind of have a grounding in was the LegCo, the Legislative Assembly, run by Carrie Lam and the chief executive. It's kind of a 60-odd person assembly. Only half of those people are directly elected. The rest are functional constituencies. So basically, like if you're architects, for example, in China, you get to nominate architects to be in this body to represent your professional interests. If you're an engineer, things like that. So it's half of it. So when we talk about Hong Kong as a democracy, it's good to know that it isn't really as great as we would like it to be, but it still has much more of a spark than maybe China itself. Yeah, so I just wanted to have that kind of grounding, that's all. But in terms then of the protests, I think it's kind of important to move on to talk about, there were protests in the 60s, and also to get a sense of, from China, how it was perceived, or how it was perceived then, how it was perceived now, how the media deals with it. So, do you want to come in?
Yes, I just want to add a little bit about, you all know, in 1997, through negotiation, Hong Kong was returned to China. And it was agreed that Hong Kong will be a special administration area. And these key things is, I'm going to mention, is one country, two system. Deng Xiaoping come up with the idea, which means that should be the case that Hong Kong people should be able to continue the way of life. But anyway, but the umbrella movement, and Bill mentioned the significance that was because it was sparked by the decision, the National Standing Committee of National People's Congress in China rejected decision for electoral reform, for a more democratic way to select chief executive. But anyway, so I think that's a very umbrella movement was labeled as the politest movement ever, protest in history, and it supposedly ended up in failure. But I think it is very important. It deepened the political awakening of Hong Kong people. And I'm from mainland China. I was born in China, grew up in China, spent most of my life there. So I would like to talk about the issue from the mainland's point of view, and as Austin mentioned, the mainland's reaction. So ever since the protests broke up, the reaction has been mixed from indifference, confusion, fascination, admiration to disgust. So, but overall, I would say that the most mainland Chinese people are not sympathetic to the protests. I think that shows the deep divide, geopolitical divide between mainland China and the Hong Kong people. I mentioned 1997. In some ways, that marked a beginning of China's rise. And I went there with my bunch of Chinese friends, and we were in jubilation. Feel right China now, the national humiliation. But anyway, that was a big moment. And ever since then, China's rapid rise in the world has not only given many Chinese people, Chinese Communist Party its legitimacy, but also given many Chinese people a sense of patriotic sentiment. But that sentiment are not shared by Hong Kong people. But in fact, increasingly, they felt that their civil rights, liberty have been eroded. As we saw the rejection of the proposed electoral reform in 2014, which led to umbrella movement, the disappearance of the booksellers, the closed down bookshops, and all these things. So, I think the dynamics is quite interesting, and Bill mentioned the tension between the two sides have been bubbling. Some Hong Kong people blamed Chinese people for pushing the property price up to the sky, complaining some women tried to go to Hong Kong to give birth, and some mainland Chinese, tourists flooded Hong Kong, and they are not always behaving in a civilized fashion. They let their children pee in the street. They eat food in the subway, and sometimes they were called, the Hong Kongers called mainland Chinese tourists locusts. In return, mainland Chinese called Hong Kongers running dogs. So the tension has been building. And I do feel that before that Hong Kong people have a sense of superiority. And I sense that clearly. I remember I went to went to Hong Kong for the first time in 1990. And in restaurant, if I asked for anything, if I spoke Chinese, and I'll often be ignored. So even now I speak English, so I'll get more attention. And I think in recent years, the fortune has been reversed. Now Hong Kong economy relies a lot on mainland Chinese tourists, and they are splashing on buy luxurious goods. I think Hong Kong people, their salary in the past decades haven't changed very much, but in China, the salary increased 127 folds. And I think, yes, I think they come from different places, which is why, some Chinese people just finished this, and I feel that the Hong Kong people, are not grateful. They say, what's the fuss you're making? You already enjoy greater liberty and rights, so what are you making the fuss? Sorry, by the way, I'm not a Chinese spokesperson. My own
Juliet, now, you can't, yeah, sorry.
My own books are not available in China.
Cindy, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we haven't mentioned so far, from history to how long this current protest has been bubbling on for, to the causes and to what mainland attitudes are, is how sour this protest has turned. I don't think it's accurate to call it a peaceful protest anymore.
Yes, absolutely.
And unlike the umbrella protest, this is not polite at all. You have had, on both sides, obviously we've seen in the West so many examples of police brutality, just using absolutely excessive force. Fortunately, no one's died yet, but live bullets were shot earlier last month. But on the protester side as well, from the very beginning, there were projectiles being thrown. Now these have turned into Molotov cocktails. There's a lot of doxing going on of people on the government side, police officers who have had their addresses being posted online and on the streets so that people can go and mob them. Anyone who's speaking, a lot of people who are speaking Mandarin are not speaking Mandarin in and around Hong Kong, speaking English instead, or Cantonese if they know how to. So there's a lot of toxicity around here, and I think this year social media has made this much, much worse. It's so easy, as we know in the West, for disinformation to spread on Twitter, on social media, so quickly before anyone fact checks them. And this has happened in a similar scale in Hong Kong as well. On both sides, you've got videos that are edited to make it seem like one side is doing worse things than the other. And it's hard to know how to fact check what is actually going on without you actually being there. There will be two sides to every story, and there will be one video that shows the police brutality, but then another video that shows 5 minutes before that police was being mobbed, and then 5 minutes before that police's friends was using brutality against the protesters. So the toxicity around the discourse is extreme. The two sides are not really talking to each other, and I really think that it's split Hong Kong people. We hear in the West a lot about how protesters from the age of 12 to 83 have been arrested for being involved. But if you really look at who's being involved, it's the younger people, it's a 20-year-old, 30-year-olds, people who generally are struggling a lot with the economy, with the house prices, who have not, just like in the West, how younger people are more revolutionary and more likely to be, Corbynistas or something like that. There are older people in Hong Kong who think, the status quo is fine. Why are you rocking the boat? And their voices, they feel like they're in the silent majority. I don't know if they are or not. I mean, opinion polls show that actually most Hong Kong people do support the protest in some form or another. But there is a lot of fear about speaking out on both sides. And I've spoken to people in Hong Kong with families who say, you know, they want freedom of speech, these protesters, but they're not giving us our freedom of speech. Well, that's obviously coloured view from their perspective, but it just shows the lack of trust between both sides at the moment.
Okay, I mean, that's another summing up speech which says we can't possibly know what's going on, so we may as well cancel. No, I think it's worthwhile just teasing into this as to what we know that the protesters want. I mean, you know, in some ways, I'll throw a rhetorical question to you. Is this about separatism, Hong Kong independence, or what do they want and where is it leading? That's the ultimate kind of conversation that we need to have. So, shall we start with what we know that they maybe are demanding, is a call for democracy, and as we've just explained, it's not a great democracy, but is it something worth protecting? Anybody want to jump in?
I think there's 5 demands at the moment. I can't remember all. I mean, there's the demand for democracy, the removal of the current chief executive, Carrie Lam, proper inquiries into the police actions. I don't think I'm quite the mad professor in Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent. I'm not necessarily saying there's a problem with sour protests, actually, because I think ultimately if protests are meaningful about things as important to people as democracy, it's not always, unfortunately, going to be conducted politely, waving your umbrella around. What interests me, actually, is another aspect of what the British left behind, which we've kind of elided, which is that the British did let the democratic genie out of the bottle in the 1984 Sino-British Declaration, because there were no elections at all in Hong Kong until 1985. So as their parting gesture, the British began the process of setting up an aspiration towards democracy. And then it became more mainstreamed, I think, just the year before the British left. So you can look at that both ways. But I think once that idea is there, it's very hard to put it back into the bottle. Yeah. How it's expressed takes different forms at different times. And, the challenge, I think, for the protesters right now is to kind of suppress the more petty tendencies that have been displayed in the past about portraying mainland China as a problem. And actually, a lot of them they're not arguing for separatism. They do see themselves as, in their minds, probably spreading this movement through China, which is, of course, Beijing's biggest concern. One very final point on this. To people in Hong Kong, their relationship to Beijing is probably the single biggest thing on their mind. You've got to remember that to the people in Beijing, Hong Kong is maybe, if you're lucky, number 5 or 6 on the agenda on a good day. Yeah, they've got other fish to fry. And so, there's this kind of aggrandized sense of importance of this dispute in the Hong Kong imagination that for Beijing it's a pain in the backside, and one that they're going to have to manage very sensitively if they're not to become what the West most wants, which is an enemy to cohere itself around. But Hong Kong's really not their biggest problem right now.
Adding the demands, I think they have original 5 demands, and one of them is withdraw the extradition bill, which has been done. And one of the some of those are reasonable, like release the protesters and forgetting the term, rejecting the term riot. But they also want universal suffrage, and I think that's quite. I don't think that's realistic. According to what has been agreed, there have to be a 5-step procedure, and there would need Beijing approval. I just cannot see that being agreed. Beijing will grant that, and I think that if the demand is not realistic, then they cannot win. And also, I want to follow up about what Cindy talked about the violence and I personally find it kind of summarize that what's going on as pro-democracy is too broad. I'm not sure how correct it is, and I find the violence very disturbing, and not just senseless attack of property, attacking Lego, and also attack Chinese people being attacked, a punch on the face just because one guy spoke Chinese, and that's just so wrong. Business associated with China was attacked. I think this is really, I think violence is really, I think I talk about how mainland Chinese people are not sympathetic, and I think I've done lots of interviews, and some people said that they were sympathetic in the beginning, and then they saw the violence and attack. And I think violence, I think is not right. It would also, it would turn away for some people potentially support the democratic, peaceful demand, and also could also give the Chinese authority the excuse to have to have bloody.
Okay, well, we'll move on to that, because obviously the Chinese authorities haven't intervened. That's almost one of the most remarkable things that we've noticed. But we'll come on to that in a moment. For now, do you want to?
Yeah, coming on to what Beijing is thinking and doing will be very interesting. I think the demands of the protesters did shift, and they are unrealistic in terms of what actually is happening on the ground with the one country, two systems. I think the biggest threat to the protesters is this sort of split and divisions within Hong Kong. They need to kind of keep a bit of unity there, because Hong Kong's gone into recession. It's being squeezed, and if Beijing lets it sit, Beijing doesn't really need to go in. The economy is being squeezed. Businesses is already looking at alternatives. It's been a really key point, a sort of entry point for businesses into mainland China, but also as a regional hub. Singapore's getting stronger, Shenzhen's getting stronger. I think the World Economic Forum put out statistics on the big cities of the future. The four in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hong Kong's not even a mention, it's already being squeezed. So this is only exacerbating or fast forwarding some issues which potentially were always going to be there, because the one country, two systems is uncomfortable, as the leader of Singapore has written about actually, or spoken about recently. So I think it's quite depressing, but the Hong Kong people need to find a way of coming through. And I think what's potentially interesting they just had a plenum in, if we come on to what's happening in Beijing, and they've commented on the situation. Why hasn't Beijing gone in? What does Beijing want from it? And I think there's some interesting we'll come on to around that, and what hope and opportunity, because I've been quite depressed about it for quite a long time, Hong Kong, but I have a nugget of hope, I think, potentially. But that's quite new, and I don't know if it's real.
My guess is talking about why, by China's standards, the Chinese Communist Party has been very restrained. I think the reason for that is, my guess is that the stake is too high. If they have a very heavy-handed way, then they will cost a huge amount of talent and capital leave Hong Kong. And also, China now have quite a tricky relationship, with US, the trade war, and with other countries. And if there's, kind of a hard crackdown, there may be sanction. And also, I think they will backfire, and they will potentially bring more people to the street.
Okay. Well, Cindy?
I was just going to mention one more demand that they have that we haven't mentioned so far, which is just independent inquiry into police brutality. And I actually think, that's not going to happen, let's be clear and put that out there now. But I actually think that would be very good for rebuilding trust, to have an independent inquiry into whether or not there has been excessive force used. We can see that from social media videos, but I'm not a riot expert. I don't know how riots are normally put down. So is this excessive force given historical riots, given international riots? Riots is a loaded term, I should say protests. So I think that would really lance the boil that's building up. Hong Kong police were one of the most respected police forces in the world before this whole thing started in the last few years. So for people to lose the trust in that, and more recently as well, there have been some students who have been found drowned near university campuses, and there's a lot of rumours going around the protester camps that is this police? Are they going out and getting us? For them to think that police would go and murder students and do something like that, that just shows how low the trust has got between the two. So I think of all the demands, I think actually that one would be, if I were governing Hong Kong, that would be one that I would be really seriously thinking about.
I think it's
My fillip to that is only to say that obviously in colonial era Hong Kong police were famous for their brutality.
1967, the riots, leftist riots. I mean, so many, that's under the colonial rule, the pro-communist
These were people
rebels.
protesting against the Cultural Revolution.
There were protests against the government, but they were beaten to death.
But that's exactly right. So why don't?
But anyway, so I just want to follow this up. I just think it's a reasonable demand to look into investigate the police brutality. But I think, I mean, by international standard, I think I don't think police is a big problem there. I mean, look at if this happened in the US, what would have happened?
Right, we can't do those kind of imaginative games, but I think we should move on. And in terms of,
I think an inquiry is just a way of kicking the ball into the long grass. You just get everybody to talk forever. Everybody gets bored. The world moves on. 5-10 years later, you look back, you're still having the inquest. It's fantastic. I mean, if I was Beijing, I'd offer to do it straight away.
if I was
Let's have
Beijing,
it.
I'd get rid of Carrie Lam and do the inquiry. But,
Whereas rumour says that she's
exactly.
going to.
But look, right. Well, in terms of like what this then represents, I think Fenella and Cindy kind of brought this idea about Hong Kong's role in the world, and I think it's, and also this kind of standoff. So the Chinese PLA are all standing there, amassed in Shenzhen on the border, but they haven't done anything. So how does that work? Because I read the newspapers in this country, and it's almost like the Western journalists are just desperately willing the Chinese to invade, so at least it might give us some legitimate authority to condemn China. But they haven't done it. So what's the geopolitical games that have been played here?
I have a comment quick on that. China watchers knew at the beginning of this year this was a really big year for China for a whole variety of reasons. So next year, gloves off, maybe something different. But there's a whole lot going on this year that Hong Kong is. Hong Kong is like in a massive firestorm of things that are happening to do with a trade war, to do with Hong Kong-Chinese tension, all sorts that are going on. The big year for China, it's just had its 70th anniversary, doesn't want anything to go wrong. There was a massive display of national unity. China is rubbish internationally at soft power. It's great domestically. It's really important. So the Chinese people are proud of where their country has, many are proud of where their country has got to, and their growing emergence on the stage. They're supportive of Xi Jinping. We're surprised by this, but there's a lot of what's going on within China that's incredibly important. So they were very excited by their strength around their 70th anniversary, but prior to that were really sensitive anniversaries. There was the 100th year of the May 4th movement, which in a sense was the instigator of the Communist Party. We can go back there or not. There was the June 4th, 30th anniversary, and there were various other anniversaries to do with Tibet, Huaobing, and various things that are happening. So all of this China watchers knew that China was going to be on tight control this year about its media and its propaganda. So that's some of the background for this year particularly. The other thing is in looking forward, the other thing we know about is there are big anniversaries on the horizon. For the Chinese Communist Party, it's 2021, and there's also the Olympics coming up. So China doesn't want Hong Kong. It doesn't want the bad press of Hong Kong going wrong. But actually, if it steps back, Hong Kong can squeeze itself. Beijing doesn't actually need to do very much at all. And I think that's quite interesting and uncomfortable as well.
But
Sorry about too long.
Well, I think Fenella's right. I think Beijing were really caught off guard with the breadth and depth of Trump's trade barriers, and that's thrown them a little bit. And I think it's also worth reminding ourselves, and I would say this to any group of students, that most of what we in the West think about China tells us more about ourselves than it tells us about China. So, a lot of, Westerners view it as this command and control, authoritarian. That tells you more about Western insecurity than it does about what's going on in China. China actually devolves more of its budget and power to its provinces than any, democracy on the planet. It's far less commanded and controlled and centralized than people imagined. It actually leads to a great deal of confusion and chaos. So in the fourth plenum, which I think Fenella also mentioned last week, it was was just in the lead up to it, Xi, who's fond of making these extremely vague edicts, China Dream and Belt and Road, which then has to be filled out by provincial officials who've got no idea what he's really thinking. Said that they're going to go big time into understanding blockchain and Bitcoin, and it's almost as and it's not something that Chinese bureaucrats understand in great depth anyway. And now you can guarantee there's going to be huge amounts of demands from the provinces for funds from central government to pursue this new Xi edict. It's much more confusing on the ground than people ever imagined. A couple of other things. The external players in this are very, very important. Let's not forget that actually one instigator of the protests is a terrible murder that occurred in Taiwan. A really gruesome, nasty, boyfriend murders girlfriend in the hotel bedroom, which is actually what led to the demand for extradition. But of course, Taiwan, being the extremely sensitive issue that it is, then didn't want to know about having the person extradited from Hong Kong to China, and then China tried to use that as the vehicle to broaden out the whole extradition thing. One other thing to look out for is diaspora communities. Diaspora communities in Vancouver and in Australia. Diasporas, as many of you will know, are often much more romantic about their view of the country that they left maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they've lost touch with what's really going on and the dynamic on the ground there. They don't share the same interests, but you can see in Vancouver certainly very significant protests and then kickback from Chinese students who are in Canada. And that could also become a point of tension for Western countries that they feel obliged to respond to.
I think that some Hong Kong people do feel kind of nostalgic about colonial rule, but the fact is that under British rule, there was no democracy. People didn't have the right to vote. In 1987, Governor David Wilson tried to introduce the reform. And that's 87, so it's hoping that for the next year there will be direct electoral. But then there was the public consultation. The view was sharply divided, and Beijing obviously didn't like it, so it was ruled out. And then last governor, Chris Patton, he also tried to introduce democratic reforms, and even including introducing, collective bargaining in the labor union. He was extremely hostile to China, and anyway, so it didn't go through. So.
Okay. Just very briefly, since we've started this kind of geopolitical conversation now, which I think is fundamentally important as to where this is going, most international relations commentators that I know of or have read have always, for the last 15 years or so, said Hong Kong's not the issue, Taiwan is the issue, which you've just raised. And we had a session in Battle of Ideas, I think 3 years ago, where the panel said China can live with Hong Kong, kicking off. Taiwan is where they have to worry, and of course the elections are happening in January next year. So, what do you think about that more generally, about those relations? This is a second conversation about the way that not just the diaspora community, but generally the establishment in this country responds to the Hong Kong protests. Because one thing, having many universities or many businesses working in China, keeping their heads down and doing what they have to do. Now they're having to confront this issue about whose side are you on. So in Liverpool University, there's been students protesting on behalf of the protesters, and then Chinese mainland families kicking off about the Hong Kong students protesting, ripping down the Lenin walls and all the rest of it. So there's a tension, and then suddenly that flares up as, what the hell is Liverpool University or whoever it is in China for in the first place? Yes, this is an authoritarian state. So how is that going to play out, or what's your views on that?
I think that's the big clash. It's a clash of culture, values. It's actually what happened with the NBA too, because the guy who's running the NBA was in an impossible position, tried to say or do the right thing. Yeah, sorry, basketball. But back home, back in America, they were like, well, what the hell are you doing?
Do you want to tell a story?
So it was just, sorry, I'm assuming people have been following the NBA more than me. But there was a tweet that came out from I think it was the head of the Houston Rockets, was he the coach, who was in support of the Hong Kong protests, quickly taken down. And ultimately, this created the MBA being banned in China for a short period of time. And there's kind of lots of commentating around that, why that happened. And the head of, very quickly, the games came back on, but the Houston Rockets have been taken down. Huge money is involved. And a lot of the NBA stars all declined to comment. And and long term, the fans in China will probably stay watching it. But the kickback has been, what's quite interesting, is the domestic audience in America getting cross about values that are far removed. So I keep coming across it again and again. It's a clash of values. Is do you want to be working and operating in China with these values? And I think that's really difficult for many companies to resolve.
Fine, Cindy.
The students' points is really interesting. I have recently graduated, as you might be able to tell, and there's a lot of Chinese students who are studying in the UK. I think probably the biggest minority group of students in the UK, ethnically speaking, are mainland Chinese and Hong Kong Chinese. A lot of the mainland Chinese come over here and they don't feel welcomed, culturally speaking. It's not because they're Confucians or anything like that, but it's just more light things like, lack of a drinking culture in China compared to here. So you don't go out to pubs, you don't socialise in that way. There's differences in humour, which then build up when a topic like this comes up. So many Chinese students that I've spoken to don't talk about politics, because when they bring it up, you get a lot of backlash, you get a lot of anti-China backlash, which is probably meant in terms of anti-government in China backlash, but it's expressing away as if it's anti the country. And that split between nation and state is really, really important. China obviously is a country all of its own, and the Communist Party has only been around for 70 years in government. So why equate the two? And when a lot of people in the West, these students, the friends that they're talking to, equate the two, the Chinese students then immediately have a backlash and say, hold on a minute, I'm patriotic. How dare you say this about my country? That's fed me, that's done this to me, that's helped me do that, that's let me go abroad to study. So there's a lot of misunderstanding on the two sides on that. And I think in this Hong Kong case, we've seen a lot of that. In Vancouver, in London, in Liverpool, a lot of mainland Chinese students are not really helping the cause by coming out with their socialist red flags and pro-China this and pro-China that. A lot of them are very rich back home, and they have a lot of disdain for the local Western students, and that comes out. You go on Twitter and have a look at the videos that have come around this year, and they're swearing at the local protesters and that sort of stuff. So that tension between the two student populations, especially given how many Chinese students we have these days, is really interesting. They're not all communists, and in fact, probably none of them are communists, but what they do feel is that their country is under attack. And I hear a lot, you only think that because you were educated in China, or people in China only think that because they're brainwashed to think so. Well, when these students come out and they read Western media, what they see is not, oh, the West was right. What they see is a backlash because they think there's a Western bias in the media, especially on, Hong Kong as a case. Why hasn't the West really reported on the violence that the protesters themselves have perpetuated? So the Chinese students themselves feel like, the mainland Chinese, feel like the world is set against them. And that's a dangerous place to be for the largest minority population of our student population.
Thanks. Very quick point.
Right, okay. But I just want to talk about one related issue of identity, and I think it's relating Hong Kong protest. And I think as the relationship between mainland China and Hong Kong kind of getting more and more stranded, Hong Kong people more and more see themselves as Hong Kongers, and instead of Chinese. It's now more kind of defined by shared value instead of ethnicity. In one recent survey suggests that those who identify themselves, 53% of people identify themselves as Hong Kongers. So 11%, lowest record, see themselves as Chinese.
Okay,
which
good.
was not the case.
It wasn't. Good. Right, we'll come back to you. So also bear in mind that 2047 is when China takes back Hong Kong. Yes, so the basic law gets revoked. So we're in a midpoint at the moment as well about people being a little bit concerned about the situation. Yes. So anyway, good. We've covered a lot of ground.
Taiwan, that was mentioned here, is a fully fledged economy and democracy. It's also an urban, sophisticated, educated Chinese society. They have elections where there are two clear red lines. They get too close to China. You had the Sunflower Rebellion of 5 or 6 years ago, which they objected about. If you get too far away, or independence gets too far away. So my question to the panel is, what is Beijing thinking? Could it allow full democracy in Hong Kong and have the Hong Kong pragmatic people put forward a chief executive that would act within those lines? So you would get, say, a pro-democracy chief executive to begin with, and then that would turn, and then that would turn, but it would stay focused on being a trading hub to generate wealth.
Very good. Okay, just bear with me. I'm going to take a couple of questions, yes?
Because I've got a friend in mainland China. When the protests kicked off, I immediately emailed her about, what is the opinion of this? And she hadn't even heard that there were any protests in Hong Kong at all. And when I was looking, I tried to go on, is it the People's Daily? This is the national, so there's a lot. Sorry, there's a lack, I didn't see a lot of kind of focus on it. So do you think there's Beijing's the idea of they're not trying to get involved, do you think there's more of an idea of why they're not publicising it more in their own media, other than it's not an essential target or aim they have in mind?
I was born in Hong Kong. I like to say that I didn't choose to be born in Hong Kong, but to be born somewhere is to acquire a nationality, and I was born British. And I would like to say how I have a very, very, long history of what has happened and the complete lack of understanding or interest by many people, including the British people, of the knowledge of exactly what happened to Hong Kong people. For example, all the Hong Kong people in 1997 who could not leave, they were British. They were not Chinese, they were British. But they were given back with the land. And it's one thing giving back the land, it's another thing giving back people. And they were literally abandoned. So these are people who have nowhere to go. They are people who are Hong Kongers. They look forward to the only future they have as Hong Kongers. They're not allowed to come here. I believe that in the sort of world we have to think in terms of global terms of the history of all colonialism, and what responsibilities the countries that created these colonies actually have for these people. And I think it becomes a collective responsibility in which we can't just say, they want this, they are there. No, and it's about China and Hong Kong. It's not. It's about Britain. It's about the entire concept of what do you do with people that you have left behind in the structure of colonies.
A couple of questions. In view of the Great Firewall of China, is there any danger of the protests spreading over to mainland China? Does China think that there's a danger of them spreading over, which may be a different issue? Another question is, what's the view in Hong Kong? I've heard there's generational differences. Does it have the potential to split Hong Kong and say Brexit is splitting Britain, or do you think people generally get a consensus view?
Pick any of those. Don't do all of them, for God's sake. We'll be here all day, right? So just choose one you want to nail.
I'll tell you why I didn't answer your question on what's international relations got to say about it earlier, Austin. That's because the world is in a very confusing position in relation to its international relations in the contemporary period. There's a lot of talk about, the so-called rules-based international, liberal order. And the Chinese look at this and they see Brexit and they see Trump and they say, where is that order? We'd quite like a bit of order. So I just don't think we're in a position to make deep predictions about what's going to happen, because a lot of what happens even in our own international affairs is reactive rather than driven by purposeful principle and strategic interests. Humphrey's question, Humphrey's the last person who chaired me before you, Austin, actually. Will Beijing allow full democracy in Hong Kong along Taiwanese lines? I can't imagine that they would do that. I just think that would be conceding being seen to concede far too much. It might be a sensible move, but, I'd go along the give an inch and that you'll find that they'll demand a mile. But just want to finish on one thing for now, which is that I've been dealing with visiting delegations of Chinese officials and going myself over to China for probably over 20 years now. I have seen China opening up. I do think that since Xi, there has been a noticeable closing down. And the last time I was there with a very good friend of mine, and we were meeting the partner of a very senior person in Shanghai, and she refused to talk to us anywhere other than in the car because she is now concerned that anything she says at work would be reported in a way that she wouldn't have done just a few years ago. It is now impossible to, in most hotels in Shanghai, even to get the BBC or any, you might think, oh, that's predictable, but it was there previously. So that's one thing. However, if you talk to senior Chinese officials, certainly at a party school where I teach occasionally, they'll say to you, do you know what our single biggest concern? It's not Trump, it's not this, it's not. Our biggest concern is we don't understand young people in China. And I actually think that's true. And in part, a lot of Xi's push towards a moral values framework and reigniting a debate about tradition is about trying to address that. There's a sense amongst the old guard that young people are just playing on their machines and they've got no idea where they are, what they're doing, what they're thinking, and a sense that they're losing control.
Useful. Cindy, do you want to...
On the mainland reporting side, you're right. When it first started, there was no reporting in mainland China at all. I would say probably for the first few weeks, if not month. But as the violence started, that gave, as Li Jia was saying, the perfect ammunition for state media in China. And, why wouldn't you call them rioters when you've got pictures of burning, of chucking things, of this and that and the other? So that gave the and I think that was when it changed. And reporting, right now, if you look at Chinese reporting, it does happen, but obviously it's not reporting as we see it in the West. It's focusing a lot on the violence, and that will have a big influence on what mainlanders think. But it's not just state media as well. It's not just TV news. It's also social media. WeChat, as you will know, is the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, all mixed together, and information disseminates on there hugely, very, very quickly. The vast majority of Chinese people, even older generations, my grandma and my great-grandma, they have WeChat. And videos can be sent on there very quickly. And I've seen some of these videos that are just, as I was saying earlier, edited to make protesters look bad. And that sort of reporting, that actually, in some Chinese minds, that's more authoritative than state media, because from decades of propaganda, Chinese people are not stupid, they're not brainwashed either. They do realize, oh, this is what the state is feeding me. Okay, so what are my friends telling me? What are my friends sharing? And that actually has a lot of impact as well. But as we talked about, disinformation can be shared so easily on that. So the reporting is state perpetuated, but also the social media is perpetuates itself. So
very good.
I feel very much with the lady who was talking about the people of Hong Kong having been left behind, and I wish, in some ways I do feel that we, the Brits, abandoned. I think it was an impossible scenario in some ways. We really don't know what's happening in Beijing's mind at all, actually. And there's just been this thing called the plenum, which has gone on for 4 days, and all of the main China watchers, who are based mostly in Washington, who've been watching for years, haven't really got a clue. And this just goes on and on and on. So I would say that, China would want Hong Kong to be a success. I think that it does not want Hong Kong to blow up. It would like it to be a model for Taiwan in future. It would like to be a global model. So I would say there might be, for the first time I thought, there might be a bit of leeway. There's no way they're going to go full democracy. It's just the terminology is, but there might be a way in which there could be some restructuring of, there's been a sort of an implication of that, and that's potential. But I think that the depressing thing for the people of Hong Kong is when Hong Kong was handed back, and in the last few decades of China opening up, there was this real sense that greater economic engagement with the world would lead to this sort of opening up of China. And everybody has misunderstood what's been going on. All American watchers, and I just use America because there are many more around Washington. Here too in London, there's been a massive misunderstanding, and this is what there's a Trump reaction now. So what's going on geopolitically is incredibly important, and she has come down harder and harder, and I think that just adds this gloom to the picture which Hong Kong is reacting to. I think there was this sense that China would open up, and instead it's flipped and gone the other way, and so it's caught everybody.
I don't, thank you, Humphrey, for the question. I don't think, I cannot possibly imagine that the Chinese Communist Party will allow Hong Kong the, universal suffrage, and I don't think they will be granted democracy, because the top leaders have been worried that Hong Kong will become a gateway for the spread of democracy. So that you mentioned a very good question, why, in many other countries, China now has a sizable middle class, and in some other countries, in Asian countries, the middle class has been played an important role in democratizing a country. But in China's case, lots of urban professionals, they really benefited from the regime, and I think literally for now, I think they probably feel too comfortable to rock the boat. The future of Hong Kong, after what's going to happen after 47, it's very, it's hard to say. But I think that the Chinese government will find a way to to take a situation to quell the protest. I think they will probably use this well-practiced purge and merge, means to crack down hard on the leader and pacify the rest, and even trying harder in easing the housing crisis. I'm not too optimistic.
Can I come back quickly on the Brexit question, whether or not it splits families? It has split families. I have been speaking to some protesters, and there's this really interesting generational split where protesters' parents generally come from mainland China as refugees or immigrants back when they were, before even the handover. And now the protesters themselves, born in Hong Kong, native, much more westernized than their parents ever will be. And they sort of disparage their parents. They think, you don't understand, you were born in China, you're not educated, blah, 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 blah. So it's a very similar Brexit comparison, actually. And just briefly, this American Life, the American podcast has released an episode yesterday, I think called The Umbrella Revolution or something like that, but where they talked to a protester and his dad, who is a former policeman, and that's a really fascinating conversation to tune into.
Okay, I think the question that was raised about, effectively, does the UK owe Hong Kongers a duty to help out in some ways? It kind of goes back to that conversation we were having before about the tension about the involvement of Western companies and Western governments in China, and that contradiction. But the idea that Hong Kongers who were born and bred as British and then were forsaken is a very important point. So we'll keep that in your head to address in the future.
Just wondering, in the long term, so the Hong Kong's case is a good example, or has a positive or negative impact on Chinese political reform. So where Beijing might consider to open political reform in the future, because that will take us, maybe we have a middle class in the future, and when our material life satisfied, maybe people need more democracy or this kind of rights. And also, maybe Beijing want to control, impose more control of the country. But if we have more control, it will have a much political instability in the future. So, like my friends in Shanghai, they might worried about the future political instability. That might affect their life and affect their business.
Hi, I'm a lecturer at the University of Glasgow researching and teaching social movements. One of the tools that has emerged during the protests in Hong Kong has been this Apple-supported app called HKMaps.live, crowdsourced app where people upload the position, locations, actions of police, but also of the protesters. I'm wondering if there's anything you could say around this, maybe talking to the reaction that's had perhaps in Hong Kong or in press if it's reported in mainland China, and maybe anything around the use of that and how you've seen that portrayed.
I think that app was withdrawn, wasn't it?
Just on Chinese students here, there's 19,500, I think you'll find. It is the largest student population outside the Brits. And we should be aware that there's also Indian, Pakistani conflicts on campuses and so on. So it's part of a wider, no, there are about Kashmir and so on. I just wondered if we could, Austin, if we could be a little bit more forensic about the demands and democracy. I fully agree that Beijing is not going to grant universal suffrage anytime soon. But is that any reason not to fight for it? I thought that was a principle, that one man, one vote is important. It may not look realistic, although, you know, a week is a short time, is a long time in politics, and many things will change in Shanghai as elsewhere. Second of all, I completely agree with Professor Derodier about the independent inquiry. You know, I'm surprised people don't call it a judge-led independent inquiry, because that's the fashion always in Britain, that will somehow solve things. It won't. But what I would like to raise is, I'm no stranger to violence. I've had violence inflicted on me by the police and by Stalinists and so on. But at the same time, I think it was an opportunity here for the protesters to find new and inventive non-violent tactics. That might also look utopian against the local police. I buy all of that. But they could have made a propaganda win by taking a leaf from Martin Luther King's book and some other people and find some way in the modern era with all the apps and all the stuff we have going for us and the incomprehension of the CCP leaders generally about young people, we could have done something. And I just wondered if there's something that can still be done.
I think blockading the airport was a publicity lose, whereas actually physically dragging down CCTV cameras was quite a nice one, wasn't it? I mean, that's my opinion.
I'd like some clarification on Hong Kong identity and Chinese identity, because I'm slightly confused about what's happened there. I was in Hong Kong in '97, the last Chinese New Year celebration under the Brits, and I was on the waterfront on one of the nights of the most astonishing fireworks you've ever seen. And I deliberately went around and spoke to as many people as I could to find out what did people think. And what I was surprised by was how overwhelmingly proud they were that they were now going to be back with China. We were getting back China. There was a sense that they were now proud to be Chinese. What's happened to that? Are they Chinese or are they Hong Kongese? What has evolved there? Because I think that's such an important point in terms, because it must give you some idea of the character of the political movements, how they are seeing themselves, what their aspirations really are, and therefore perhaps why they're not able to break out of Hong Kong.
Aren't there local elections at the end of this month, and will they have any importance as like a shadow democracy?
Yeah, I'm interested in the relationship between China and Hong Kong. Like now that China's opened up to the rest of the world and it's risen through the reforms, and like Hong Kong's kind of lagging behind. Like you see Shenzhen like right next to Hong Kong and it's doing so well in comparison. I was wondering like if Hong Kong still has a use to China as like a trade center or like whatever else, and if not, what do you think the future of Hong Kong is?
Yeah, quick comment on what you've heard. Again, not everything, just pick a few bits and bobs.
I think Beijing can afford to let Hong Kong atrophy. I mean, it's not its ideal solution, but it can. I don't think businesses will necessarily move to Shenzhen or Shanghai, because I don't think they're world cities that are cosmopolitan enough to appeal to the kind of white, global trotting banker class who want Filipino maids. And so, you know, Singapore's the place that's going to pick up the pieces currently. I think that's most evident. The one thing I think I wanted to pick up the point made here at the front, and then the gentleman over there who made a very good point about how did they identify. And I think, you know, first of all, I want to tread carefully here, because I don't want to dismiss what's going on in Hong Kong. I think there is you know, the demand to be heard is an entirely positive demand. And, you know, it might not be, you know, conducted in the way that we think ought to be done, in the most pristine way with, you know, purple umbrellas instead of bricks and Molotov cocktails. But, you know, you can never predict in advance where change is going to come from in society. And sometimes it comes from a direction that you were least expecting, you know. Populist movements across Europe that are supposedly right-wing and caricatured as such maybe capture a democratic demand and sentiment that other liberal parties have more, you know, seem to have forgotten about. And the same may be true in Hong Kong, that, you know, it might not be smart, it might not be clever, but there's a few things I think they could do to make themselves smarter. I think they would be, Joshua Wong and his mates would be far better off going over to Shenzhen and talking to people there and trying to identify with mainland Chinese and picking up on that point about how do you see yourself. They're the people they have to win, you know, not senators in Washington who want to virtue signal about, you know, human rights in China and then walk away when, you know, the shit hits the fan, as they have done, you know, all over the Middle East, and I could go on, you know. So, you know, I think that's the big one. I think one other final point at the moment is Beijing understands that it does need to loosen up and, you know, become gradually more democratic. But like all such organizations, it's going to take a few kicks from outside in order to truly move in that direction. It understands that there is a creative dynamic in Hong Kong. It's probably not entirely sure why, that it needs. And I think that comes from, you know, you have to be a free thinker in a, you know, and you have to value freedom in order to be truly creative. And, you know, if China's really going to achieve its potential and not just be, and, you know, I always point out to my students, when I was young, Japan was the future. Now people talk about China as the future as completely evident, but it's far from being evident. China's got lots and lots of problems, internal and external, to overcome first. And one of those will be to loosen up and encourage free thinking, which I suspect can only come from free people.
Before you come back, let me see any final hands here.
Yeah, so this one's more about like the media portrayal that is surrounding this whole thing. And I just want to pick up on Cindy's point, where she said about like Chinese students often experience that backlash from their like Western counterparts being like, no, we're right because we represent, you know, the... And about how I think in this country, like, there really is a real racism problem towards Chinese people. I've heard a lot of people say things about Chinese students and about Chinese tourists which are derogatory, dehumanizing, and frankly disgusting. And so given that framework and that kind of lack of understanding and that sort of like unacknowledged racism we have in our society towards Chinese people, what are some specific things we should be looking out for in our media portrayal of these events? Because I think there really is a lack of understanding for, like, you know, what was Li Jia's side of things, like what people in mainland China are thinking about, and perhaps we should sometimes be a bit more critical of our own media surrounding these kind of events. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, very useful. You, sir.
So my understanding is that one of the background causes of the crisis is, as you've mentioned a little bit, is the housing crisis that so many young Hong Kongers can't afford anywhere. And that's due to the fact that there's only a monopoly in real estate among a few oligarchs who have good relationships to China. So two questions. One is that if you think that China could change that, would that sort of make the protests go away, or are they largely principled at this point, so they won't go away? And is it possible for China to change its relationship to those tycoons and introduce a more free, or at least a housing market that would meet the needs of the people better?
Okay, it's the panel, so we'll just take whoever you want to take. Tell us what you think. Anti-Chinese racism in the UK, or in UK media maybe. You know, can China actually... Would it be progressive for China to economically intervene in Hong Kong and maybe provide cheaper housing? I mean, they're already building a new island and investing in a new island to improve the land value or increase the land value. creative class, which we've talked about, reforms in Shenzhen. I think the question about identity and what role we should have and what guilt we should have, maybe, about how we've mistreated UK citizens. So anyway, there's a lot to go on. So who wants to kick off? Final 1 minute points. Oh, come on.
Okay, I don't think it's the economy or housing. That's a Beijing argument, as it is, a common kind of anti-populist movement argument. It's economic concerns. We've allowed, societies, to polarize between the people. Of course, there's an element of that. I'm not denying, obviously Hong Kong is an incredibly unequal society in many ways. But it's not the be-all and end-all. I think there are other value-driven issues that get elided and forgotten about if one looks at it purely in economic terms. I think it suits Beijing to talk of it in those terms as an economic problem. It particularly suits Beijing that the US, has passed the bill that it has, because, for weeks Beijing was talking about foreign interference in its sovereign affairs and CIA agitators on the ground in Hong Kong. Now they've got something concrete to point to. So, well done, United States Senate. The only other thing I wanted to pick up on was how should our media portray these things? I think that's a fantastic question because,
Got a man dying in the front row.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's got water. Because, of course, it's a difficult argument to have over here in the context of a polarized Brexit debate, that, you can't be, lauding up the democratic aspirations of people in Hong Kong whilst you still haven't resolved Brexit over here, I think.
Quickly on the media point, I think there is a lot of anti-Chinese racism, and one of the things that I've seen online recently is this term Chinazi, which really just sickens me. Yes, you can criticize the Chinese government for a lot of things, but, again, it goes back to this nation-state divide. Is it really right to be dragging China's name through the mud, rather than what you're talking about is communist policy, you're talking about Beijing's policy, So I think that's a sort of insidious creep into our language that we might not even realize when we're saying, China's done this. No, no, it hasn't. It's you should be more clear about exactly who the party is. In terms of the media portrayal, always ask why. Always, if something doesn't make much sense to you, or if something makes too much sense, why would there be people who are anti the protesters, if they had all of the moral high grounds? They're always trying to understand the other side. And not speaking Chinese, either Cantonese or Mandarin, makes that harder because you can't communicate to the people on the ground on their level. But I would say that always, when you are communicating with Chinese people from either side of the divide, just thinking, they're not brainwashed. They're not saying this because the government's told them to. Always give them the benefit of the doubt. Why does a rational human being say something like this? And if you can't understand where they're coming from, then there's something wrong with your framework, basically.
And I think I totally agree with what you said, that China is rubbish in soft power in China, and especially after the trade war. I think recently China's image is really getting even worse, and particularly darkened by what's been happening in Hong Kong. And I do think some of the fear about China, it's not, the animosity towards China is not always justified. I think some of the fear about China is generated by ignorance.
For me, just to sum up, I think with Hong Kong, it's one country, two systems. That ain't going to change. Hong Kong have a lot to fight for, not violently, but to get their people together. I think Beijing can shift a little bit. I don't think it's going to be so. I think there's room for manoeuvre, and that's where my hope is, which is slightly different, and that's new hope. So I don't know if it'll go anywhere. But back to the point about fundamentally, Hong Kong is. Oh, and a quick comment. Hong Kong wasn't famously the most creative place in and around China. There are other really creative places in China, so I don't think it's creative class. Hong Kong is not necessarily that exceptional. There are plenty of other places bubbling up in and around China, but it's in an important place. It is important for Beijing. It's important for the world. It's got a lot to fight for non-violently, and I think if it can find its way through, its Li Ka-shings and its billionaires can help sort out some of the problems. There's a lot to play for. But fundamentally, away from all of that, there is a kind of potential coming clash of values and cultures. And whereas a lot of Chinese people speak English, very, very few people have any ounce of understanding of China, what is going on, any of their history, any of their literature, any of the understanding. And so the best thing you can do is spend a little bit of time giving even just a sense of understanding to that great country, which is coming to play an important part in all our lives.
Yeah, so there. I would only add, which I think Bill was saying about creativity, rather than it being kind of personal or even a kind of obviously there's lots of great stuff being created in China, yes, and has been for a very long time, but the idea of creativity itself as a autonomous action of critique that you have, you know, like in the UK we have creative classes who are meant to be disruptors, you know, who are meant to...
yeah, but Hong Kong had to ship in creativity.
No, we understand. I wasn't making that point, but I was making the opposite point about China not having it, precisely because there is a social restraint on anybody that is autonomously thinking or disruptive, suddenly gets a bit of a kick up the backside. So, you know, it's restricted, it's restrained. So the social framework of China doesn't allow it in the same way as it would do under a free society. That's the benefit of free society, I suppose.
Did you notice, by the way, that both the protesters and the police were putting up their demands and messages in English, so which told you immediately they're talking to the international gallery anyway. They're not talking to each other. They're seeking support.
Well, yeah, they're not talking to Beijing, that's the point.
But I would just want to say,
It's
you know,
never ended.
it's not it's not in Beijing's interest to destroy Hong Kong. So that, you know, gives me some hope. It's not in Hong Kong has served China very well, and so I don't think it's in their interest to destroy.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, as it happens, I think, you know, the fact that the Hong Kong dollar is a transferable currency on the world markets, and China still hasn't really got its stock exchange system working freely yet. Hong Kong is still needed. It's still needed as a trading centre, a massive trading centre, as much as anything else. Anyway, still lots of questions, but no time. So can we just thank the panel, please, for a fascinating conversation.